Effective horror leans on the unfamiliar. The thought of placing yourself in the extreme situations your favorite horror game protagonists do is undoubtedly worrying. However, horror media has a habit of overusing tired old tropes and illogical cliches in attempts to ramp up the tension. For instance, endlessly repeating jump scares that just lead to desensitization become annoying and ruin suspension of belief, something which horror games arguably must work harder to obtain than other genres. Overused settings. Utilizing environments in which the player is likely to have zero real-life understanding is a tried and tested way for developers to whip up tension. Long abandoned places, flickering corridors of mental asylums, rural locales detached from society, strange derelict towns, spooky forests. These environments crop up time and time again in horror games to the point where it's becoming tiring. Their surprises are totally expected. Keeping us in the dark. Darkness itself isn't scary. It's the threat lurking within the shadows which gets our hackles up. Daylight sections in Resident Evil 5 prove lightness can be creepy, but well-lit scenes in general offer a moment's respite and relief. This contrast between light and dark is an underutilized tool. Plunging into darkness renews blood-curdling dread, which may have all but evaporated after a period of light. Furthermore, over-relying on pure darkness desensitizes players. Instead, games could more harness the subtleties of in-game lighting to enhance their foreboding atmosphere. Too many non-essential collectibles. Video games present unique opportunities to flesh out narrative context and lore with cleverly placed environmental cues. Notes, audio logs, photographs, a whole manner of collectibles can support overarching tension without disturbing narrative flow. Dead Space's iconic blood-strewn cut off their limbs and PT's radio news report spring to mind as potential environmental storytelling. Why is it then that a ton of horror games rely on excessive note-gathering to pad out a game's lore, or, at worst, provide the heavy lifting for the game's story entirely? Like, who's leaving all these handwritten notes during a zombie apocalypse anyway? Constant scouring for fuel. Another overly prolific collectible is fuel, be it matches, oil, or batteries. Playing Amnesia Dark Descent requires oil to fuel the lantern. This mechanic is built into the gameplay, with encounters hinging on whether enemies can see its light. Therefore, it's kind of good, albeit sometimes annoying to keep searching for oil drums. In the case of batteries though, why do developers insist on littering batteries with ridiculously short lifespans into their games? In examples such as Outlast, player focus shifts between patiently eking battery power and constant need for resupply. Also, why was Miles so woefully underpowered to enter Mount Massive Asylum with only 2 batteries anyway? Audio logs cutting out.
What is that?
It's a busted array like we thought. Sounds like they're having problems with their encoder.
Yeah, we're nitpicking, but seriously, who is stopping all these audio logs recording as soon as a victim meets their demise? Is it the victim themselves? Perhaps stopping the tape as soon as their hiding place is rumbled? Maybe it's the murderous entity pressing stop before they partake in a spot of killing. Just imagine how freaky it would be if the tape continues to run. We'll hear the moment of death, and then its grim aftermath. The monster, zombie, or whatever skulks off to find its next victim, leaving us with hours of static room tone, in the company of the deceased. Dodgy flashlights. For an example of masterful flashlight implementation, see Alan Wake. Despite one too many occasions, the torches guzzle battery power. Their functional dual-weapon approach with gunfire was relatively novel at its time. Alan Wake's flashlights serve a purpose, but in other games they're simply a tool to see in the dark. It's obvious, of course, but if they're featured in a game simply to serve such basic functions, why build in something as annoying as flashlights, which flicker every so often? Looking at you, Dead Space Extraction, or The Last of Us, frequently shaking the controller to recharge a flickering light isn't immersive, it's just plain distracting. Surviving without weapons. Horror games rely on suspension of belief, of course, but you are honestly telling me that you wouldn't grab whatever was lying around to use as a makeshift weapon? Amnesia: The Dark Descent was one of the early adopters of this weaponless gameplay mechanic, encouraging players to sneak between the cracks to avoid confrontation with the game's monsters. It is quite effective, but I can't shake the feeling that were I in that situation, I'd be chucking tables, chairs, dressers, statues, whatever I could get my hands on to keep those pesky gatherers at bay. Gore for gore's sake. If used sparingly, the shock factor in extreme blood and guts can be quite effective. The mangled zombie neck you first encounter in Resident Evil 2 Remake's outset is quite a disturbing scene setter, and it's rather tame in comparison to the gruesome deaths befalling the unfortunate teens in Until Dawn. The point is, those games aren't all-out bloodbaths, as the gore is deployed in subtle ways to reinforce the game's overall tension. Compare this to an all-out sludge fest in Dead Space, or the relentless skull-bashing in The Evil Within. It's dumb fun for sure, but similar to an overabundance of dark environments, it loses its appeal as scare factor quite quickly. Underutilizing player imagination. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Great horror lies on fear of the unknown. Often it's the spine-chilling dread conjured by your own imagination that'll provide greater intensity of fear. Case in point, Kitty Horror Show's anatomy takes place entirely within the cozy spaces of a suburban house, yet the gameplay loop of walking through unlit hallways to collect tapes is deeply troublesome. You're confronted with the idea that even in your own home, a seemingly safe place, fear can stalk you, but what that fear is, you just don't know. In contrast, games like Outlast show you almost immediately what your threat is, as you'll see an escaped patient running amok at least 3 times, preparing you for its first jump scare. Insurmountable objects blocking pathways. Ever overcome your deepest fears whilst crafting all manner of ill-assorted items only to be flummoxed by a cabinet blocking a doorway? Didn't think so. This trope features in pretty much every horror game going: the hospital bed, the stacked tables and chairs, office furniture. We know developers block certain pathways to maintain linearity in a game's direction, and that everyday items jamming a door shut implies some sort of frenzied attempt at barricading a space, keeping whatever is out of there from coming in. It's just downright amusing that after fending off a barrage of undead enemies or crazed psychopaths, it's the cabinet in the hallway that's the real killer. One-dimensional protagonists. It's strange that in many a survival horror game, the protagonist is so darn bland that oftentimes it's hard to care about what happens to them. For all the triumph of Resident Evil 7 and 8, its protagonist Ethan Winters is as dull as dishwater. His horrifying quests to recover the lost family member of the throes of dread would raise the pulses of anyone, yet Ethan remains stoic throughout. It's obviously a design choice, but many a player understandably finds it hard to engage with him personally. Call the cops, maybe? Sorry, Ethan, but we're gonna have to drag your name through the mud again on this one. Upon seeing your wife on video, a whole 3 years after she disappeared and was presumed dead, you decide to head to the Louisiana swamps without so much as a courtesy call to the police. I mean, that's the first thing I would do if a long-lost person suddenly reappeared after presuming them dead for years. Weak monsters. Silent Hill 2's Pyramid Head is perhaps the pinnacle of horror game opponents, freakish, otherworldly, and hard as nails. This monster ramps up the tension due to seemingly being impervious to bullets, for they'll only slow them down. This ties into the narrative purposes of the game, of course, but were this any other series, there's a high chance Pyramid Head would have been a terrifyingly imposing monster with an unnecessary weak spot. Think giant eyeballs on practically every Resident Evil monster, or for something more amusing, the Hierophant in The House of the Dead 2, who, for zero reason whatsoever, keeps opening his ribcage to expose his heart. Illogical inventory combinations. It's a simple premise, but strictly limiting player character inventory spaces forces you to either consider the essentials for survival, freeing up space by combining items, or to solve puzzles. It makes sense most of the time. Combine batteries with a torch, combine herbs to create powerful health items, that sort of thing. Silent Hill 2 has some laughably illogical resource combinations though, harking back to the early days of point-and-click adventures. Perhaps most famous is the infamous horseshoe, where the player must task James with combining a wax doll and a lighter with said horseshoe to create a door handle, which can be used to open a prison door. Yeah, makes sense. Resident Evil 6. Yeah, we're going there. It's all in the name of good dumb fun after all. Resident Evil 6 encapsulates a host of tropes highlighted in this rundown. Huge, hulking monsters with easy-to-expose weak spots, such as the admittedly hilarious when you think about it, zombie T-Rex Simmons, excessive gore, see Leon's stomach-churning meat grinder demise, and a cast of strange, derelict cities. If Capcom had marketed this game as something other than horror within the Resident Evil canon, then we'd probably view it through a different lens. What we have got, though, is zombies with guns, and for that, we must conclude this game is all kinds of dumb fun. That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on GamingBolt.